This episode was sponsored by Warner Brothers. Childhood is meant to be the most carefree and joyous time of our lives, but true evil exists in this world, and more often than not, it preys upon the innocence of children. That's why so many of us have childhood trauma, experiences from our young lives that will haunt us forever. My new friend, Dead Leaf Clover, is here to help me tell these childhood horror stories. Be sure to give her tons of support by subscribing to her channel via the link below. But before we begin, my sponsor has the most horrifying childhood story of all. What would you do if the greatest terror of your childhood came back?
For 27 years, I dreamt of you. I've missed you.
The final disturbing chapter of It is coming to theaters this weekend. It Chapter 2 brings the chilling supernatural story of the children of Derry, Maine, to a haunting close. The story takes place 27 years later.
You need to come home.
Pennywise.
The clown. We didn't stop it.
Close your eyes and see.
It Chapter 2.
The Losers Club is grown up, but it's time to face their past once and for all.
Swear it. If it isn't dead, if it ever comes back, we'll come back too.
Do you have the courage to return with them? Bring your Losers Club back to Derry, because it is back.
Hello.
And it ends on September 6th. We made an oath. #Losers Stick Together. Get your tickets to watch It Chapter 2 on September 6th with the link in the description. My wife and I watched the first film twice, we loved it so much, and we'll definitely be there opening night to finish it off. Thanks once again to Warner Brothers for sponsoring this episode. Support them and support this channel, and join us by getting tickets to see It Chapter 2 with the link in the description. Now, let's see what kind of childhood horrors you guys have sent to me. The Wolf, from Yume 130794. This story happened to me when I was 8 years old. I was spending my winter vacation with my grandparents at their house in the mountainside of my country. My grandparents don't live there anymore, as my grandfather died in 2012, and my grandmother moved closer to us in our city. She's 85 now. So when I was 8, my mom moved us to Atlanta, Georgia in the US for a while, leaving me and my father home. My father had 2 jobs and no time to raise me, so I'd often stay at one of my grandparents' houses, either her parents or his parents. The house was in the mountainside. These were the grandparents on my dad's side. We still own that house, which is officially 135 years old now, and it's one of the oldest and best preserved houses in that area. It was even caught in both World Wars and the Balkanic War. While playing in the dirt, I used to find bullets. This neighborhood was kind of linear, in the sense that there was a road, and on each side of the road were lines of houses, separated from time to time by smaller streets that would head towards a river and a train bridge. I would often go across that bridge, staring into the river as a child. One night around 7 p.m., I recall sneaking out into the garden and into the small street. I made my way over to the river and train bridge. Our house was on a hill, and the river was downhill. As it was winter, it was quite dark outside, but I loved exploring the wooded area, which the bridge was near. To reach this area, I would have to go downhill and face a fence with a gate that would indicate the houses have ended, and that the rest was wilderness. I opened the gate. It was always open because someone broke the lock a long time ago, and nobody bothered to fix it. Then I step inside. I had my grandparents' dog, Picky, with me, a very colorful collie. Picky was the kind of dog that would follow me anywhere if I left the garden. Even if I locked him in, he would probably just dig under the fence and come after me. He was always by my side and ready to defend me. As we enter that gate, I hear Picky growling and staring into the woods at seemingly nothing. But I can see the fur on his back raising up, just like cats do when they're ready to attack. He even began to bare his fangs. I follow his gaze, and I see something terrifying. A large wolf emerged from the tree line and began to approach me with gracious, menacing steps. I hear the snow crunch under Picky's paws as he is slowly backing away from this thing, intimidated, lowering his ears to his head. He seemed to be backing down. At first I was confused as to why, but then I saw this beautiful wolf cub clinging to the other wolf's legs. It was a mother and her child. At first I was in awe, but then I shivered with more and more fear. I'd seen enough National Geographic to know that mother wolves, mother animals in general, were savages when they had to protect their young, especially if they felt threatened by other animals or people. And there I was, a defenseless human child, with a collie growling at her and her cub. The snow was thick, and I was winter dressed, but I knew I couldn't run faster than a wolf, even regularly. If she lunged at me, if she decided she wanted to end me, it would be all over. I had never been more petrified. It was then that I broke down crying. I was scared, of course, but there was another reason for my tears. To be honest, when I saw that gorgeous wolf cub clinging so closely to its mother's legs, I thought about my own mother. I felt so vulnerable, so alone, so motherless in that moment. Picky was now behind me, moving slowly away from me. He was whining, trying to convince me to run with him, but I could not bring myself to move. I locked my eyes with the wolf the entire time she was there. I felt that if I turned my back away, or if I broke eye contact, she would jump at me immediately. I felt the tears on my cheeks cool to near ice, and I started to talk to that beautiful yet terrifying creature. In the calmest voice I could muster, I began to tell her how pretty her cub was, and that I was a cub too, that I didn't want to hurt anyone. I kept saying things like that for what felt like an eternity, the mother wolf never breaking eye contact, staring right into my soul with those yellow eyes. This encounter lasted maybe 5 to 10 minutes, but it felt so much longer. She looked at her cub, who was now agitated, then looked back at me one last time before slowly turning around and walking back into the woods with her baby. My entire body felt like it just unlocked. All the adrenaline faded out of me. I broke into a real sob, wiping my eyes and thanking God that I was not hurt. I ran back home, and the moment I touched the gate to the back of the house, I heard a beautiful, chilling sound. The wolf's howl. It was the first time I'd actually ever heard one in real life. Although this experience was creepy, it only made me respect and admire wolves even more. Nature is scary, that's true, but it is also very wholesome and serene. Ever since then, I've made the wolf my spirit animal.
The Chicken Coop by TheCutestBean. Greeley Hills, California, a lovely little podunk town if you know where to find it. Considering it's a meager population of almost 1,000 people, you really don't expect much to come out of there, except for the odd tourist and drug addict. However, whether it's a blessing or a curse, that's where I grew up. One of the many backwoods of good old Cali, almost forgotten by what I consider a normal society. I'm almost 26 now, with several fond memories of that little old church on Stout, the dilapidated social hall, and all my crazy neighbors at the time. What strikes me most, though, out of all of those stories, is one incident from when I was about 10 years old, and a right terror to the local populace. I had always hated the compound, what we lovingly called the half-acre of land my family lived on at the time, after dark, and it was already twilight when my mother asked me to go out and feed the chickens. I had sat there, on the stairs in our living room, pouting. My arms crossed and my little halo of curls mussed as I glared at my mother, stating, for the 1000th time, that there was no way I was going out there in the dark to feed the stupid chickens and hunt for eggs. Now, going out after dark was very common. There really wasn't anything to be afraid of out there, and my mother knew that. The bears and mountain lions in the area tend to leave you be as long as you leave them alone too. Only real thing you had to worry about up there was the neighbors' rotties getting loose and chasing you down, which they did on several occasions, but those are stories for another time. Oh, or coyotes, they were there too. It took some minor threats and perhaps a firm kick to the rear, but I was finally on my way down the gravel driveway to the abandoned storehouse we used as a chicken coop and storage area. I was jittery and nervous as hell, scuttling down with flashlight and basket in hand, my goal in plain sight in front of me. But once I got there, I knew something was off. I was about 3 yards away from the locked storehouse, and there was not a sound to be heard. No chickens, no noises from the bunny hutch by the door, and no barking from the pepper Dalmatian that typically followed me around the property. All pretenses of fear dropping away. I began to unlatch the door, a frown creasing my tiny face. I remember thinking that perhaps a chicken hawk had gotten in, or a bobcat, but nothing like that would silence 20 Rhode Island chickens. You could pick up one of the little idiots and they would continue to walk around as if they were still on the ground. I flicked on the flashlight and immediately dropped it as screeches rang out from inside the building. Flinging open the door, I pointed the flashlight inside with trembling fingers and was struck dumb with terror. A huge, shaggy, shadowy mass of a dog, larger than my 10-year-old height, stood there, a chicken in its mouth, growling and drooling as it cast baleful red eyes upon me. It felt like time had frozen. My little heart threatening to beat out of my chest as I stared at this monstrosity of a dog. That was over all too fast. It dropped the chicken and dove straight towards me, jaws agape with a growl that burned my ears as fire. I slammed the door, latching it just in time to hear something connect, and booked it home, tears streaming down my face. I was positive that it was still coming after me. My mother, who was doing bills on the table, looked at me once and sent me back outside in a huff, assuming I was overreacting to get out of doing my chore. I wish she had been right. I approached the coop again and was surprised to find the door still closed, undamaged, and still latched. If the door was still closed, it had to still be in there, right? I closed my eyes and unlatched the door for a second time, swinging it open and expecting to be eaten on the spot. Silence. I opened my eyes. Nothing was out of place. The inner coop door was still closed and latched. The inner fencing was undamaged, and there were still 20 chickens clucking around. My jaw dropped. Had I been imagining it all? A chuff sounded from the darkness, and Pepper, the Dalmatian, popped out from behind a bale. She trotted past me, her snout in the air as she crossed the threshold to the door. Maybe I just saw Pepper after all, right? A few years ago, I was telling this to my roommate, Guadalupe Maria. She was a very superstitious young woman. She swore that ghosts existed and would get pissed at me whenever I suggested we go to the Winchester house for Halloween. I sat there on my cot in our shared room, shell-shocked at the level of concern and despair that emanated from this woman the moment I mentioned a black dog with red eyes. She grabbed my arm and desperately asked me how many times I had seen it. Once, just that once, I assured her. She seemed to calm with reassurance, fear evident in every line of her body. To be honest, I'm not sure if she was being serious or not at this point, but something tells me she was as skeptic as I am. I can't help but be a bit worried. She told me that if I ever saw that black dog with large red eyes again, that I was going to die. I laughed her off at the time, but now as I'm writing this, I'm scared again. You see, last night on the sidewalk outside of my house, I saw a black dog with shining blood-red eyes. Maybe it's my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe I'm just getting old and paranoid. But what does a washed-up hillbilly from Greeley really know? After all, monsters don't hide in chicken coops, do they?
Strength does not come in numbers. From Yume, 130794. This is a story from a friend of mine, who gave me permission to tell it, as long as I did not mention her real name. For the purpose of anonymity, I will refer to my friend as May. May lived in a small village to which I shall not give a name to, as some of her family members still live there. The story is about her childhood within her large family. She had 9 brothers and 8 sisters. Yes, 17 other children in the house besides her. They were impoverished, barely managing to live from day to day. I remember when I would go on vacation to her village with my family at my aunt's house, which just happened to be just 4 houses down from hers. I remember the fun we had. Having so many other children to play with growing up had its pluses. She was the 4th youngest child in the family. The oldest was around 30, while her mother was 48 and her father was 53. The other 3 older sisters were between 18 to 27. I always thought they were a pretty religious family. They had a lot of crosses in their house. They would always pray when eating. They always attended church and never missed a religious ceremony. May loved all her siblings because they all felt very connected with each other and would often joke that they were a small army. Let's not kid ourselves here, they definitely were. The boys would always protect their sisters, take them to school, bring them back home. The 4 older sisters would be like their 4 extra mothers, bathing the toddlers, the babies, cooking for them, tucking them in at night, basically helping out their exhausted mother. May's mother was a very soft, stick-figured kind of person. Skinny, giving the impression that she was underweight, but she was always nice to her children, her children's friends, or their families. She would always offer us fruits or ask if she could bring us anything to drink. If we ever fancied some candy, she would even bring us that. As skinny and weak-looking as she was, that much of a kind, gentle, and nurturing person she was quite strong-willed and a great person. Then again, I never failed to notice her sad eyes. She had light blue eyes and a light chocolate, natural and long hair reaching her hips. She would always wear it as a braided pigtail. All of her 8 daughters looked almost identical to her. Some had her eyes, some had her father's eyes, which were dark brown. May's father, on the other hand, was the opposite of her mother. He was a tall man, about 185 to 190 centimeters tall, and well built. He was a farmer after all. Now I know. How are they poor if they owned land to farm on? Well, they didn't. From what May told me during a conversation years ago, their land was taken by the bank because they were too deeply in debt at the time to afford it, and it was either their land or their house. Prior to that, her dad was known around the village for sometimes abusing alcohol and sleeping days in, instead of working the land to sell his vegetables and fruit cultures. But people in the village also knew their financial situation, so they all sort of turned a blind eye. The man did have a big family to support. Besides the vegetables, their land had plum trees, peaches, apples, but because he wasn't much attending to them, the fruits would often dry out and die in the summer sun. When the bank took their land, it simply ruined them, pushing her father to find work on neighbors' fields to farm their cultures, and May got pulled out of school at the age of 8, as did her sisters. The teachers were told that they would be homeschooled instead. The boys continued to go to school somewhat, but on an interrupted schedule. They would work in the fields with their father, while the girls took care around the house. Obviously, her mom was overwhelmed with raising so many children. He, on the other hand, was never nervous or mean to his children. Regarding some of the house rules, he was a strict father. They all had curfews, regardless of their age. They would all have to wear certain clothes. For example, the girls weren't allowed to wear pants. None of his daughters were allowed to have boyfriends either. Their only male friends would be their brothers. Considering the fact that they had 9 boys, I always thought they were more than enough, like a little football team with some reserves. At this point, during my conversation with May, her eyes became sad as her mother's often looked. She told me in a sad tone, "You know, it's kind of funny. Most people think that strength comes in numbers, but for us, I don't think it does." I glanced at her and shuddered. "What do you mean?" To which she replied, "We've become fewer." Wait, what? I was startled because whenever I would visit May from the age of 12 to 17 or 18, her mom would often brag about her older children, talking about their studies, what they did for a living, the places they go, the boys they dated, their dreams. But I also remember that one by one they would leave their rural village to town and didn't make much of it. They were much older than me and May, and therefore harder to connect with. May took a deep breath, looked at me with a broken semi-smile, and says with watery eyes, "Due to my dad's unemployment and alcohol abuse, my mother's incapacity to work and take care of all the children, hold the house, and the fact that he took me, my sisters, and brothers out of school, my sisters were pushed to move out of our house so that there would be less mouths to feed. They moved to the city. I was sad for a time and scared for them, but also hopeful. But they stopped coming to visit us the following years. They wouldn't write either. They wouldn't even call on the phone. The only phone we had, which my father kept to himself. I grew up assuming that my sisters just forgot about us. It wasn't until a few years later that I noticed something. My sisters Ellie, Emma, and Rebecca got at the age to move out, as Dad liked to call it. It was happening again. He was pushing them to move out just as he did before. This time I was determined to look into it, especially because it won't be long until I'm next. I go to my sisters. They're crying and sobbing while packing, sort of trying to make me laugh though, to cheer me up. As they were packing, Ellie pulled me over and whispered to me that our dad made a phone call, discussing a trip and money. Dad left twice with my sisters, the first time and the second time. Watching my middle sisters leave, I told myself that it won't happen to me, and I realized how wrong I was. I knew it was coming for me too, so I ran away when one of my brothers moved out, going with him so I didn't have to see my dad again. Now that I'm older, I have an idea of what my dad was doing, and we're now saving up money to hire a private investigator. I've never seen those sisters again, and it's believed that our dad sold them to someone, a way to get money to fuel his alcoholism, seeing the girls in his family as expendable, as objects. I miss my sisters, and I don't even know if they're still alive. But I'm glad I left before I was sold too. When May was done talking, I looked at her with tears in my eyes. I had no idea it was this bad. I had no idea that I nearly lost my friend. It was troubling to see her innocence be lost so fast. Now she resents her father, and she hopes to find her family alive.
Did She Just Want to Play by Layla G. You know memories from your childhood that you never forget, such as playing with friends, toys, going to certain places, etc. This experience comes to me as vividly as a positive, nostalgic childhood memory. This had to be one of the most terrifying experiences I had as a child. It happened very quickly and had no climax, but it was very startling to my 5-year-old mind. I'm not sure if this was a vividly frightening dream, which I remembered, but it felt very real. My house as a child was not out of the ordinary, and it did not display any signs of paranormal activity from what I can recall. It was a normal night, and I was in my room playing by myself while my parents were downstairs cooking dinner. I can remember suddenly feeling the air going still and having the urge to turn around. Out of curiosity, I did turn around, and just as you can guess, what I saw left me speechless. Standing in the middle of my doorway was a little girl, which appeared to be my age and height. Her eyes were big and doll-like. The best comparison I have is her eyes looked like the eyes of the corpse bride in the movie The Corpse Bride. She was all white from head to toe, including her hair, with cracked skin. Her hair looked matted and stringy. She had a very pointed chin and a sad aura surrounding her. She also appeared to be dressed in a long, old-fashioned nightgown. This all happened over the course of a few seconds, but I have carried on that image throughout my whole life. The little girl just stood and stared in the doorway. I did not feel threatened, but nonetheless, I was still terrified. It was just a random sight to my mind. I remember wondering if what I was seeing was real. I remember thinking if the girl wanted to play. After a few seconds of staring at each other, I blinked and she was gone. It took me a minute to finally move and react. I screamed a minute after all of this happened. In the end, my parents did not believe me. Every time I thought of this experience, I always remembered it in the same gut-wrenching emotion of fear. I truly have wondered if this was real and my mind was tricking me into thinking it was a false, vivid memory I made up, or if it was a realistic dream. To some, this may sound like a badly made-up story, but this is an actual memory I carry from my childhood. What truly disturbs me is if this wasn't real, how could my 5-year-old mind conjure up such images? This was the only time in my life even after the events, that I had seen something which paralyzed me in fear. All I remember is having an urge to turn around. Once I did, I felt bad for making her go away because I really thought she just wanted to play. As a 5-year-old, I felt this was a serious matter, which was new because at that age, everything is so carefree. I remember feeling sad for the girl, but my fear was stronger because I had never seen something like that. Currently, I look back on that memory in fear because even now I cannot explain to myself what I saw, how I saw it, and why I saw it. I just assume she wanted to play.
Nearly Taken from Moonchild 444. This is a quick but extremely creepy experience I had when I was 4 years old. It happens to be one of my first memories, and it says something that one of my first memories was a traumatic one. I remember being in the car with my dad. I was sitting in the back seat on the passenger side. I remember clearly that he had to stop somewhere to grab something out of a convenience store. Now, this was a bad idea, but keep in mind he was a very young dad. I was his first kid. He was in a hurry, and he didn't expect to be in the convenience store more than about 60 seconds. As I sat there waiting and alone, not really thinking about how alone I actually was, I remember seeing this old white guy with long, untamed, dirty blonde hair. He was extremely skinny, especially in his face, with his cheekbones so obvious and distinctive. The guy looked hungry. Now he approached the car window and instantly tried to jerk open the car door. He was frantically trying to open the door as fast as he could, not caring if he made a scene. I remember this vividly because it scared the living heck out of me. I remember him running away at top speed only seconds later as my dad came into the car and we left. My dad must have never seen him because he simply drove away obliviously. I didn't tell him either. I was so young I didn't know what was going on. But now that I'm older, I realize the terrifying truth. The guy, the way he looked at me as he tried to break into the car, the way he avoided all the other doors to come straight to my door, he was trying to take me. And I thank God that he didn't get in time.
The Midnight Door by Melissa. This is a truly creepy experience for me. I'm an adult female in my late 50s. This event happened to me when I was 12 years old. A little backstory to put these events into perspective. I grew up in a well-to-do family. We lived out in the country, 35 miles from the city. Our nearest neighbors were at least a mile away. Our home was secluded, and we owned 16 acres of land, the majority of which was forested and right off a major highway that traversed the entire state of Louisiana. This is important and will bear much relevance to my story. Another relevant piece of information to the backstory is that because of the isolation of our home, we had been burglarized on several occasions. Now, to the story. It's not long, but to me it was creepy. In fact, downright spooky. My mother and father have long since passed away, so I don't mind telling you that my childhood was a mixed blessing. I was very much loved by my father. However, he traveled a lot for his work. This, however, left me at home with my mother, who was abusive towards me and my younger brother, but not to my younger sister. From the age of 12, when this event happened, my mother started leaving me home alone with my 8-year-old brother and my 2-year-old sister. Because of the distance between our home and town, Mother would leave me alone for hours at a time with my younger siblings. She would usually preface her leaving with a warning about being careful and reminding me that if anything happened to my brother and sister, it would be my fault. My mother and father's marriage were not a happy one. In fact, it was turbulent. I attribute this to the tremendous age gap. It was a May through December romance, with my mother being significantly younger, and being a younger wife and then mother, and being left home alone quite often. However, they tried to keep the marriage together for the sake of us children. This event happened on a Saturday evening. I remember because my mom and dad decided to go out for the evening. And as I mentioned, my dad, traveling a lot for work, he was only home on weekends. My mom and dad got dressed in their best, and they both gave each of us children a hug and a kiss. Mom reminded me to leave the doors locked, and with that, they were gone. I knew what time I had to make sure my brother and sister were in bed. We had already been fed dinner. Mom knew that I couldn't cook. I do remember that this happened sometime in the fall, as it was already dark by the time they left. I was scared of the dark and usually had some kind of light on in the house. In fact, I had left the porch lights on. It was easy enough to see because our front door had a stained glass window and also windows on each side of the door. I put my baby sister to bed about an hour after my mom and dad left. My brother was allowed to stay up for about another hour. So, by 10 p.m., all was quiet. I was in my room with my door closed and listening to my radio and reading. I remember that I was growing sleepy, so I eventually put the book aside and turned the music down, then drifted off to sleep. No one usually came to our house, especially at night, and not without being invited. So, the sound of someone knocking at the front door startled me awake. My heart began pounding in my chest. I was immediately frightened. Getting up out of bed, I went to my window, which overlooked the front yard and the carport. My parents weren't home yet. I didn't know what to do. There was another knock, and I almost started to cry. I left my room and walked down a short hallway, then turned right down a longer hallway that would lead to the living room. When I got to the edge of the living room, I peeked around the corner, and to my horror, the front door was standing wide open. I gulped hard, and my mind was frantically racing on what course of action I should take. After a moment, which seemed like an eternity, I decided to run and close the front door. What would I do? I thought nervously if a stranger were in the house. Tears were forming in my eyes. With great trepidation, I tried to summon up my courage as I stepped into the living room. My mom had a beautiful white and gold trimmed baby grand piano that somewhat hid the front door, so I crept over to hide behind the piano. I took a deep breath and stepped around the piano and lunged for the door. I'll never forget the shocked look of surprise on my face when I suddenly saw my mom and then my dad. At first, I was overwhelmed with relief. However, it turned to anger when my beautiful mother stepped inside and said calmly, "I just wanted to see how you would react in case something like this happened for real." In the meantime, my dad pulled the car up under the carport. They had apparently pulled back far enough so I wouldn't see it. After this, my trust in my mom eroded. I just couldn't trust her anymore. We didn't have a good relationship to begin with, but this didn't help. My dad said that he hadn't wanted to go along with this, and I believed him. It's been 45 years since this occurred, and yet it still haunts me to this day.
Windigo of Vedauwoo, Wyoming, from Hero 001. I was joining my parents at a family friend's house at a party. It was the summer of 2012. When we made it to the party, it was pretty typical. Adults drinking beer and doing shots and being loud, while the kids were playing video games in a separate room, to let the adults be adults. My friend Des and I were in the middle of a Modern Warfare match, and for once in my life I was actually beating him. We were talking about going camping. I looked over at S and he smiled, getting up as the match ended, and he left the room. A few minutes later, he came back and said to me, "Well, you got your wish, man. I convinced my parents to let me take you on a couple days trip to Vedauwoo. They seemed pretty happy to have some more time to themselves." I jumped up and replied, "Let's get to it then. I'm ready to build a fire." S had always been like a big brother to me. He was a few years older, and I was 13 at the time. My parents even thought he was a good influence on me, which was probably the driving factor here. Later on that day, we hopped in his pickup with all our gear, then set out on our camping excursion. When we made it to the camping spot, we saw that someone was already there, so we decided to go a bit further back to find a better spot. We happened upon a small area that was surrounded by trees next to a river. We set everything up there in a hurry, because we wanted to get to the airsoft fight we planned while getting ready. It was already starting to get dark, so S had the bright idea that we continue with the airsoft match, but in the dark. I followed along with it, because I wanted a challenge. We headed out in different directions, then called out to one another, "Ready." I took a deep breath, then yelled, "Go!" I vaulted over the log I was behind, and I took a quick look before heading off to a more advantageous location that I saw uphill. We both had sidearms, nothing fancy. Getting to the spot, I looked around for any movement. As my eyes began to adjust to the darkness, everything got easier and easier to make out. Seeing better in the dark in such an occasion has its perks. I scanned the area, and I saw slow movements between some trees. Quickly, I took aim and smiled, following the moving shape. I thought I had S in my sights, but I was wrong, because somehow I lost him, even though the trees were only 20 feet away from me. I then suddenly heard a twig break behind me, and I rolled to the side, making myself slide down the hill and aiming back up it, trying to find S. There was no one there that I could see. I lowered the pistol to get a better look. Once again, I saw the outline of a person. I could make out an arm and a shoulder a quarter way up the tree that I was near. I popped off a couple of BBs at the person, but realized this was not a person. I heard the rounds connect with a light thwop, and by then I was already assuming that what I fired at was not human at all. It began to step from behind the tree into view under the moonlight. All of a sudden, I was hit with the most disgusting smell. What had stepped out of the woods was hardly human-shaped. It had 2 arms and 2 legs, but it was so unnaturally thin. It was thinner than the trees it had stepped out from behind, but it was easily 9 feet tall, with bones jutting out from just beneath its skin. Its eyes were red. They felt like they were violating me and piercing my soul. I couldn't help but whimper when I saw its head. It was wearing a deer's rotting skull, but I could see a humanoid face underneath. It was just wearing the skull like decoration. Its teeth were like little daggers. Seeing the look on its face reminded me of when my dad would see a magnificent buck while hunting. A look of excitement and hunger. I jumped up and began to run down the hill, almost falling twice. When I made it back down the hill, S popped from around a tree with a smug look on his face, pointing his airsoft gun at me. The smugness went away as he looked behind me though, and I didn't need to say a word. He saw the thing as clearly as I did. Later on, I would learn that he saw the thing smile at us. He said it moved like something in an online video game where the other player is lagging with terrible internet. S pushed past me and yelled, "Run for the truck." I listened, sprinting as fast as my legs could take me. I looked back to see S shooting at it, backing up as he was getting ready to book it. I get to the pickup, hopping inside, then watched what would happen next. I looked just in time to see S picking himself up off the ground, winded. He made it to the truck and opened the door, starting it. He was coughing and having trouble breathing. As we left the area and got on the road, I looked back to see the thing standing at the entrance to Vedauwoo, glaring at us until we went around a corner and lost sight of it. All the way back, S was freaked out and kept saying, "What was that? What the heck was that? It kicked me to the ground." I kept quiet. I didn't have any answers and I was in shock myself. When we got back early, everyone was worried about us. We simply told them that a pack of coyotes had got a little too curious for our taste, so we decided to call it quits. It wasn't until years later, when I was talking to my Aunt Mona, who was full-blood Kiowa native. She was telling us about the tribe's mythology. She discussed a creature that sounded insanely familiar to what we saw that night. She referred to it as the Windigo, and now I fully believe that's what it was.
The Dogs Were Howling by Anonymous. This is not a personal story, but my mother's. I have never encountered anything strange or out of the ordinary, and if I had, I've always found an explanation for it, such as an extremely active imagination in my childhood years. What I mean to say is that I have no reason to believe in ghosts or strange creatures that crawl in the dead of night in a forest, and that for me, ghost stories simply represent a means of entertainment. However, my mother is a serious woman and not the kind of person that goes around telling fantastical stories. In fact, I have only heard her tell the story twice, and never did she change any of the details of it. Once in a family gathering when I was still a kid, and at the other time she told me when we were alone and I was almost 17. Needless to say, I believe her, and even though I'm not sure what she saw, I believe that she did see something that was not normal. Before getting to the story, I will tell you a bit of background story. My mother grew up in the mountains of Puerto Rico. To those who do not know, Puerto Rico is an island situated in the Caribbean. Back then, it was normal that a family owned a patch of land, and that there they would build their houses. So it was common to find 5 to 10 houses that belonged to a single family, built in the same small terrain. If you had grown up this way, then it would have only taken you 5 steps from your house to get to your aunt's, uncle's, grandparents', or even great-grandparents' house. In my mom's case, the closest house to hers was her grandfather's. Her grandfather was a very tough old man. He ended up living to be 96. Growing up, he had worked in the sugarcane fields, which he ended up doing pretty much all of his life. When he was a boy, he contracted polio. Luckily, he survived and was able to go on to live a normal life. However, he was left with a severe limp in one of his legs. This was also the reason why in his old age he had to use a wheelchair. Now, let's get to the story. In many Latin American countries, there's a legend that says the reason why dogs howl at night is because they can see death passing by. It was very late one night, and my mother, who was still a kid back then, was woken up by the howl of dogs. She was unnerved by the noise and decided to seek refuge with her sister, who was sleeping beside her. She tried to wake her sister, but she didn't even stir. The howling was growing louder, and my mom was becoming even more nervous. She slowly made her way to her brother's room and tried to wake him up as well, but failed. At this point, my mom was on the verge of tears and could only think of one last place to go: her parents' room. Now, to get there, she had to cross the living room, which had big windows, from which she could look outside. She was trying to get there, wondering how on earth could anyone sleep through this noise. When she got the urge to look out one of the windows, there it was, a tall, dark silhouette, only noticeable by the fact that it was darker than its surroundings. It had arms and legs, but there was nothing more to it. It was like looking at a featureless shadow. My mom could not look away, though. She was glued to her spot. But then it turned around, and it had eyes. They were unnaturally big and red, almost resembling a red traffic light. Mom snapped out of it and ducked under the windowsill, trying to hide and hoping it hadn't seen her. She felt as though her attempts at hiding were futile, and that the thing could see through the walls. Suddenly, though, the dogs stopped howling and everything was calm once more. My mom finally made it to her parents' room and succeeded at waking them. She told them what had happened, and naturally, they thought she had a nightmare, or that at most she had seen the eyes of a mikaro, a kind of owl that lives on the island, reflecting light from somewhere. With this, she went back to her room and tried to sleep again. However, the dogs began howling again, this time louder than ever. The next day, as it was summer break from school, she went straight to her grandfather and told him what had happened. He looked surprised and proceeded to tell her what had happened to him that same night. He had also been awoken by the dogs and could not fall back asleep. When the dogs stopped, he tried to sleep, but then the dogs began to howl again, and when he opened his eyes, he saw a black thing trying to get in his room by crawling through the window. He quickly grabbed his cane and began to hit it and push it back, and at the same time he began to shout the name of his youngest son, who still lived with him. But no matter how much he called, no one answered. At the end, he began praying and kept hitting the thing with his cane, and could finally push it out of the window and close it. He never slept that night. When my mom told her grandmother, she gave her some of the wisest advice anyone could give. The things of the night you should always leave alone. If you hear something strange in the night, or catch a glimpse of something from the corner of your eye, don't get up from bed. Don't look out that way, and don't make a fuss. Just make sure everything is locked and ignore it. It will eventually go away. I just hope she was right.
Why me? From Dave. I was 10 years old when this happened. I was a curious kid back then. I had to know and see everything myself. Back in those days, I had a little corgi named Mortis. Yeah, from Brawl Stars. Sometimes I even called him the Bringer of Doom, because he was sometimes like a little devil. It was a snowy day and I was playing with some Legos, and Mortis was lying next to the radiator. At one point, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like light tapping on glass. Being as curious as I was, I grabbed my Nerf gun and quietly snuck into the kitchen. Before I entered that room, Mortis, without any reason, sprang up like a rocket and charged right into the kitchen while barking like mad. Now I knew something was up, because Mortis never acted like this. In the meantime, while I was trying to analyze the situation, Mortis stopped barking and let out a deep growl. I had to know what was going on, so I sprang out from behind the door. I wish I would have just stayed put, because what I saw scared the heck out of me. Next to the sink, where the window was, the window that looks out to the forest and a field, stood a creature that resembled a decaying wolf standing on its back legs, parts of its body falling off. The strange thing was, its legs were more like a goat, ending in hooves, and its tail was long and bushy. Judging by the height of the trees next to it, I would say it was 8 feet tall or more. But the creepiest thing about it was that it didn't have eyes. Rather, it had empty sockets, and it seemed to smile. I don't know what it was looking at out there, but it seemed very happy to be seeing it or not seeing it. In the blink of an eye, I got a quick look at it before it charged back into the woods and disappeared. I was so terrified at its appearance that I had begun crying. From that day on, I had a fear of that freaking window, because I was scared that I would see it again. And to this day, I'm afraid that I might.
I Met a Crazy Boy on Valentine's Day by CrazyAlleyCat. I'm a 27-year-old girl, and even though the story happened almost 20 years ago, I still think back to it every year around this time. I was a 9-year-old girl in grade 4, and it was Valentine's Day. We had spent the week decorating our class door for the yearly competition and making a big card for our principal, vice principal, and other office staff, signed by all of our class as our entry and invitation to come see our theme-decorated door. I don't remember how this part came about, but I was the one to walk downstairs to the office and turn our card in. It was simple enough, and I always looked forward to getting out of the classroom, even for a little while. So I started to the office. Nothing spectacular happened on the way down or in the office. It was just a normal walk through the halls and down the stairs, and then cheerfully turning in our class Valentine's Day card. I started down the same direction I came from, but had chosen to go up a different set of stairs than the ones I had gone down. Now, just some small layout for you. The school is a big rectangle with a large auditorium that had granite floors in the center. The second floor was a couple stories up and had an open balcony with a short railing overlooking the auditorium below. The classrooms bordered the lower and upper hallways, and I had windows facing outward. It was also a World War I historical building and cannot be changed significantly or knocked down. But back to the story. I was coming up and out of the stairway and had started to walk towards my classroom, but I heard a whistle, one that sounded like a bird, and instinctively I turned around to see what it was. There was a boy sitting on the floor outside of the 6th grade classes. Kids were typically sent to sit outside the classroom as a mild punishment or to calm down. When I turned around to look, I met eyes with the boy, and he had some kind of smirk on his face. Before I could turn back around to start walking, the kid says, "Ooga booga." WTF, seriously? I just giggled and turned around to get back to class. A few seconds later, I was being pushed up against the short railing overlooking the auditorium, far below. He pushed, and it was quite a struggle. I will not pretend like it was easy for me as a little girl, but somehow I managed to get a kick right where it matters. The boy dropped, and I ran crying back to the classroom. I don't remember much of the events that followed immediately afterwards. I really think I was in shock. However, I know exactly how it all turned out. My mom was pissed beyond words. I'm her only child, and it took her 5 years to have me. So needless to say, she was livid at the idea of losing me. My mom threatened lawsuits and going to the local news and newspaper. It turns out the kid had many behavioral, mental, and learning disabilities, and his parents had not been giving him the correct medication or attention that he required. It was a long argument that went on for weeks, but in the end, my mom did have sympathy for the boy who was clearly not being given the care he needed. She did not, however, have sympathy for his parents, who she saw as responsible. My mom settled for having the boy removed from the school district and having the school put a taller railing up so this might not happen again to someone else. But the story doesn't end here. After this event, my mom was ultra paranoid and signed her little ballerina up for karate. I was not thrilled about this, and my thought was, I defended myself just fine, so why should I need karate? Anyways, when I showed up to my first class, you want to know who I saw in that room? Yep, it was the little boy who had tried to push me over the railings. I pointed him out to my mom, and she was in 100 miles per hour, crazy mommy mode all over again. After my mom explained what that boy had done to the instructor, the boy's mom was told she could no longer bring him to class there, and they were to leave immediately. His mom got mad at me. Why she misdirected her anger, I will never know. Her child could have killed me or left me seriously injured at the very least, and it was due to her negligence and her son's behavior. As much as I know it was due to his very unfortunate circumstances, that doesn't make it okay. That doesn't make me feel safe to be in the same room with him. And I also don't know why she thought it would be appropriate for a child who just showed he could and would use violence to be taking martial arts. Therapy would have been a more logical route, in my opinion. After all these years, I still think back to that day, and I wonder what became of that boy. I wonder if he got the help he needed. I wonder if he remembers. And sometimes I even ask myself if it was all a dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was something I will always remember and learned many lessons from. The biggest being, always be aware of your surroundings.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's extra long episode. Be sure to give a round of applause and subscribe to Dead Leaf Clover. The link to her channel is in the description. Thanks, Dead Leaf. Also, this episode was sponsored by Warner Brothers. Be sure to support this channel and support our sponsors by getting tickets to see It Chapter 2 via the link in the description, and join us in the final chapter of It on September 6th. Well, that's the end of these stories, but more scary stories are coming soon. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.